Welcome, everyone, to our discussion on one of the hottest debates in religious studies, whether Jesus actually existed or if he was just a mythic creation, a product of literary invention.
Absolutely. It's a topic that really shakes the foundations, doesn't it? What's the first angle we're looking at?
So, we have the mainstream academic view largely pointed to by Bart Ehrman. Ehrman argues that, despite his agnostic and non-supernatural stance, he firmly believes that Jesus the man was a historical figure, a radical Jewish apocalyptic preacher, really.
Right? And I recall he points to multiple sources, both from within early Christianity and from secular accounts. Yeah.
Sure, Ehrman notes that the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, contain overlapping traditions which, even though they're theologically biased, suggest there were earlier oral histories like actually relaying real events. Plus, he emphasizes Paul's letters. These are our earliest Christian documents, and they mention Jesus, his brother James, and of course his crucifixion under Roman authority.
Correct. And that criterion of embarrassment plays a role too, right? The idea being that a crucified Messiah wouldn't be something early Christians would just make up because it was so humiliating.
Exactly. It's like saying, why would someone invent a savior who ended up facing a disgraceful criminal execution if it weren't real? Ehrman argues that this very well-known shame actually supports the argument for a historical Jesus.
I can see that. It's a clever point. But then we have the counter view from mythicists like Dr. Richard Carrier, right?
Right? Carrier and his fellow mythicists take a completely different tack. They contend, using Bayesian reasoning, that the evidence is so scant and internally inconsistent that it's more likely Jesus was a mythic figure, one constructed over time rather than an actual historical person.
Yeah. And they note that Paul, our earliest Christian author, never really presents Jesus as a human being. Instead, Paul describes Jesus through visions and scriptural experiences, almost like experiences of a divine mystery figure.
Exactly, and that distinction is key. For mythicists, the fact that Paul doesn't recount miraculous accounts in a straightforward historical style, but rather relays visions, almost like those in ancient mystery religions, fuels their
Right.
argument. They also point out, for instance, that the Gospels were written decades after the supposed lifetime of Jesus.
Which brings up an important aspect: authorship and timing. If these texts are written so long after the events, then they could have been heavily influenced by the theological needs of later communities, rather than being strict historical records.
Exactly. Kind of like rewriting a story to make it more heroic, And mythicists argue that such rewriting could transform a mythic archetype into a seemingly historical figure.
I get that. But then, don't a lot of scholars, even those not strictly religious, still side with Ehrman's assumption that the overlapping sources lend credibility to the historicity of Jesus?
Absolutely. Most critical scholars do support Ehrman's perspective. The methodological tools, like textual analysis and the criterion of embarrassment, are well entrenched. Scholars such as Paula Fredrickson and John Dominic Crossan argue that although the supernatural elements are later reinterpretations, the core historical narrative around Jesus stands firm.
Right. And Ehrman isn't defending traditional Christianity either, is he? He doesn't buy into miracles or resurrection himself, which makes his case all the more interesting. It shows that accepting Jesus as a historical figure doesn't necessarily mean embracing all the miraculous claims.
Exactly. It separates the man from the myth. It's like acknowledging that someone's a real person, even if later stories about him are elevated, exaggerated, or even, cosmic in nature.
And speaking of cosmic, mythicists really lean into the parallels between Jesus and other dying and rising deities in ancient cultures, right?
Right. They often bring up figures like Osiris or Mithras. It's like saying, look, these narrative tropes were common in antiquity. Virgin births, resurrection, miraculous healings, that, all of this was part of a broader cultural pattern.
Yeah, but then, isn't it a bit of an oversimplification to say someone is just a copy of earlier deities? I mean, couldn't it be that real historical figures sometimes get mythologized over time?
That's a valid point. And Ehrman counters that the embellishments alone don't negate the fact that a person existed. It's like, a minor detail. The core event, like a crucifixion, remains too significant and grounded in reality to be completely fictionalized.
It sounds like the core of the debate isn't about the supernatural, but rather about how we approach the historical methodology. Are we reading these texts as straightforward records or as literary works laden with symbolism?
Yes, exactly. Ehrman and his like-minded scholars maintain that despite theological embellishments, ancient texts can give us reasonably accurate accounts of events. Mythicists, however, argue that in a time dominated by, visions and allegory, we need a higher standard of evidence before we can accept someone's historicity.
That raises another interesting issue: the impact this debate has on modern cultures. I mean, if Jesus were hypothetically a complete myth, that would be pretty revolutionary for billions of people, wouldn't it?
For sure, it's not just an academic dispute. It's an existential shadow that looms over Western civilization. Christianity, they say, is the very foundation of our moral and cultural framework. So questioning the historicity of its central figure shakes a lot of deeply entrenched beliefs.
Right. And while most scholars lean towards the view that a man did exist, however mythologized the accounts might be, the implications of purely mythicist conclusions are, like, enormous in terms of cultural impact.
Absolutely. It's not just about history. It's about identity, morality, and even politics. If a core historical event is under question, then the narratives built
True.
on top of it come under scrutiny.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, how do each of these camps view the texts from historians like Tacitus and Josephus?
Great question. Ehrman views the references in Tacitus and Josephus as corroborative, despite their imperfections and potential later alterations, because they come from independent non-Christian sources, which gives them additional weight. You know, they serve as external attestation that something like Jesus was indeed a historical figure.
And the mythicists, do they simply dismiss these texts?
Well, not exactly dismissed, but they argue they're too riddled with interpolation and editorial tampering to be taken at face value. They say that the core references might reflect later attempts to insert a historical grounding into an otherwise mythical narrative.
Yeah, I see. So it kind of boils down to trust in historical transmission methods versus their susceptibility to ideological aims. And both sides have their valid points, don't they?
Right. But here's where I want to respectfully challenge a mythicist point. It's, not that the texts are entirely fabricated, but that the methods used to evaluate them might be too rigid or too influenced by modern expectations of historical documentation.
Agreed. That's interesting. So, you're saying that, even if texts are tainted by later edits, the underlying historical kernel might still exist?
Exactly. It's like, you can think of it as a photograph that's been overexposed in some areas but still captures the overall scene. Ehrman argues that even with embellishments, the archaeological and textual evidence points to a real, lived experience that gave rise to Jesus as an individual.
I get that. And then there's Carrier's approach, which, as you mentioned, employs Bayesian reasoning, essentially weighing the probability of events occurring. But isn't that method sometimes criticized for being, too subjective given the variables involved?
Absolutely, it's one of the common critiques. Bayesian reasoning depends heavily on the prior assumptions and probabilities you assign. And, in the case of ancient history, that can be extremely contentious. So, while it's a neat mathematical way to look at it, many scholars feel that historical methods grounded in textual criticism and contextual analysis better capture the complexity of the evidence.
That makes sense. I mean, you can crunch the numbers all you want, but the subtleties of language, cultural context, and human behavior almost defy strict numerical analysis.
Exactly, and that's why, despite the burning questions and revolutionary implications, the majority of scholars stick with the view that there was, a historical figure behind the narratives, even if the mystical overlay was added later.
So, if we sum it all up, we're really grappling with the nature of historical evidence, balancing written testimonies, independent references, and the evolution of myth over time. It's a cerebral tug of war.
Absolutely. A tug of war that forces us to confront our assumptions about history and narrative. And, it pushes us to question, who really created the Jesus we think we know? Was he a real, flawed man, or an idealized symbol molded by generations?
And that question, honestly, cuts to the heart of how we construct our identities and beliefs. Whether you lean towards Ehrman's rigorous textual analysis or Carrier's mythic reconstruction, it's clear that this debate is far from settled.
Right? And it's a dynamic conversation that's constantly evolving as new perspectives and methodologies emerge. It's, part of the excitement in exploring ancient history and its influence
Absolutely.
on modern thought.
It's fascinating to see how one debate can have such deep implications, not just for scholars, but for how billions perceive their own traditions and origins.
Completely. And while we might not end up with a definitive answer anytime soon, examining these perspectives enlightens us about the intricacies of history, belief, and the human need to find meaning.
Right. This has been such an engaging dive into historical method, myth-making, and religious identity. Thanks for unpacking these layers.
My pleasure. Whether Jesus was a man or a myth, the discussion itself challenges us to refine our understanding of history and the narratives that shape our world. Thanks for listening.